Hi, I'm Andy, and this is my lesson on accessor methods in Java. In this lesson, I'll show you how to add accessor methods to a class. I'll also discuss the anatomy of a method and how to use the toString method to get a description of an object. Let's get started. Here's the rectangle class we've been working on for the past few lessons. In those previous lessons, we added class and instance variables up here, and a couple of constructors here. Now it's time to add the last part of our class, the methods. Methods are commands we can give an object. They generally fall into two types: requests for some information and requests to take some action. In this lesson, we'll focus on methods that request information from the object. These methods are called accessor methods because they allow outside code to access information about the state of the object. To determine what accessor methods we should add to this class, we need to think about what information do we want to request from a rectangle object. The simplest thing we can ask for is the values of its instance variables. For example, let's add a method that asks a rectangle for its ID. We'll call that method getID because it allows us to get the rectangle's ID. We want to allow outside code to call this method, so we start our method header with the public access modifier. Then we put the return type, the data type of the information returned by this method. This method will return the rectangle's ID, which is an integer. So we put int as the return type. Then we put the name of the method followed by parentheses. As mentioned earlier, this method will be called getID. In the parentheses, we put the formal parameters, just like with constructors. These parameters hold information that help the method complete its task. When a rectangle object is asked for its ID, it does not need any additional information in that request. So this method won't have any parameters. Then we put curly braces to delineate the method body, the code that will execute when we call this method. The purpose of this method is to return the rectangle's ID. We do that with the return keyword, like this. You can think of return as meaning exit this method and send back the following value. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go over to the main method and make a rectangle object. Then we'll invoke the getID method on our rectangle object. Remember, we invoke methods on an object by using the dot operator on its reference variable. Also, remember that this method returns an integer value, the rectangle's ID. That means we can capture that return value and store it in an integer variable using an assignment operator. And then we can print the value of that integer variable. Or we could just print the returned ID by putting the method call itself in the print line statement, like this. Let's run this program and make sure both print lines correctly print the rectangle's ID, which should be 1 since it's the first rectangle created in this program. Good, so both print lines correctly printed the rectangle's ID. Let's go back to our rectangle class and add a few more accessor methods. First, we'll add getLength and getWidth. These three methods are the simplest methods you can have in a class. They simply return the value stored in an instance variable. Now let's make a few slightly more complicated methods. The first will be called area because it will return the area of the rectangle. Let me show you two ways to do that. First, let's calculate the area by multiplying the length and width together and then store that value in a double variable called rect area. Then we need to return the value in rect area. This method works well, but let me show you a more concise way to do the same thing. Let's first comment out all this code. Now, instead of making a variable and returning its value, we could simply return the value that results when we multiply length and width together, like this. Again, the first way we did this was perfectly fine, but let's go with this second way since it only requires one line of code. Now let's make a method called perimeter. That one should be fairly easy at this point. Now let's add a method called isSquare. The purpose of this method is to determine if the rectangle object is a square, meaning its length and its width are equal. Notice this method returns a Boolean, true if the rectangle is a square and false otherwise. We can do that by returning the result of a Boolean expression, like this. Let's add one more method before testing our code. This method is an important one that you'll want to add to most of your classes. It's called toString, and it returns a reference to a string object. The purpose of this method is to return a string containing a full description of the rectangle object. Invoking the toString method on an object is equivalent to asking that object to tell you about itself. So if we ask a rectangle object to tell us about itself, it should probably return a string containing all its instance variable data. Here's one way to do that. We could have done this in a single return statement like the other methods, but I think this way makes it more clear to a reader exactly what info is in the returned string. Also, we could have added some additional information to the returned string, like the rectangle's area, but let's leave it like this for now. Okay, let's go over to main and test some of these methods. We'll leave this code that makes a rectangle object, but then we'll print the rectangle's information using toString. We'll also print out whether or not the rectangle is a square. And then we'll print its area and perimeter. Okay, let's see if that worked. Good, so everything worked as expected. Before we go, let me show you one more feature of the toString method. It turns out if you simply put the reference variable in a printline statement, the toString method will be invoked automatically. Here's what I mean. We'll get rid of the dot and toString and rerun the program. Notice we got the same result as before. So you can decide if you want to explicitly put .toString in lines of code like this. Just remember, if you don't put it, it will happen automatically. And that wraps up this lesson on accessor methods in Java. I'm Andy. Thanks for watching and coding with me today.